Hi, everyone. If you are here for the Empowering Recovery webinar for educators and providers, you are in the right place. As everyone gets logged in today, feel free to share where you're located in the chat. Yeah, we'd love to always hear where you're tuning in from. Great. And then throughout the webinar, please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A and the chat at the bottom of the screen using the host and panelist section. We will always take questions towards the end of the webinar, so you don't want to miss out for those opportunities for your questions to be answered. Fabulous. We have Burlington, Vermont. Amazing. Amazing, amazing. I'm tuning in from Connecticut today, so we have our Northeast friends. Indiana, wow. Evansville, Indiana, driving to Nashville, Tennessee. Ooh, amazing. That should be fun. Hope you have a safe trip. Nashville, I've always wanted to go. Lexington, Kentucky, amazing. Amazing to hear, amazing. Alrighty, fabulous. And I do have to say, I have to apologize if you can hear my dog in the background. We've been having an off morning so far, so I do apologize. But if you're here again for the Empowering Recovery webinar, you are in the right place. Again, always feel free to share any questions you have in the Q&A and chat at the bottom of your screen using the host and panelist section. We like to make sure we're keeping everything with privacy. So in the host and panelist section, and then we'll be able to answer your questions. So yeah. Alrighty, well, it's 12:05, so we'll get started. And hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Balance webinar, Empowering Recovery, Insights for Educators and Providers. So thank you for taking the time to log on today. Just by tuning in, you're really putting the energy toward learning about yourself and getting the support you or someone you know may need. So we're happy to have you with us today. My name is Amanda Young. I am an intake coordinator here at Balance, and I will be your moderator today. Just a bit about Balance. Balance is a premier eating disorder treatment center offering boutique outpatient treatment options using evidence-based practices to provide customized care that best fits you and your loved ones in recovery. So as we move through today's presentation, again, please feel free to share any thoughts, reactions, questions in the chat. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them through the Q&A panel. I'll make sure to keep a lookout so your questions are answered along the way. And again, we also have some time set aside for questions at the end as well. We just ask that when you are typing questions, comments in the chat, please send them to the host and panelist option. So that way we can keep any sensitive information private from others. Yes, well, as I mentioned, my name is Amanda Young. I use she, her pronouns and am an intake coordinator here at Balance. I am a former educator, third and first grade teacher here. So this subject is really close, near and dear to my heart. But now I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Korie Born, Balance's own intuitive eating, health at every size content creator and former master level educator. Korie uses she, her pronouns and is a former educator turned intuitive eating counselor and content creator. She holds a master's degree in education for which she studied the effects of eating disorders on academic success. Korie's passion for eating disorder awareness and treatment spread to her classroom, where she helped her students build resilience around their body image and resistance to diet culture. So thank you so much for joining us today, Korie. We are so very lucky to be here with you, and I will pass it on over.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was such a lovely introduction, and I am so excited to be here. Hi, everybody. I'm just really thrilled to be here today to discuss such an important topic, talking about, how educators and treatment providers can play a role in preventing and addressing eating disorders in schools. Eating disorders affect so many school-age people, and I think it's high time that we talk about why that is and what we can do as educators and treatment providers to make a difference. So let's start by looking at our objectives. You can see them on the screen. We'll start by unpacking the connection between academic pressures and eating disorders, kind of the why behind the rising rates of eating disorders among school-age people. We'll also look at some eating disorder programs that successfully foster recovery in the US and abroad. We'll talk about what might be missing in schools that could support students in their recovery, and then move into some evidence based tips to support your students or clients that are in school. And last, you'll have the opportunity to engage in discussion with us at Balance and with each other to learn together and help your students or clients thrive in school this year and beyond. So, before we get into it, let's first take a look and kind of break down why this even matters. It might seem obvious. I mean, you signed up for this webinar. Obviously, you think that this topic matters, but I just want to make it very clear. According to Johns Hopkins University, the most common age of onset of eating disorders is from 12 to 25 years of age. So, this is an age range where the pressures of school really, sort of start to ramp up. In many cases, middle and high school is the first time where grades start to quote unquote count for the first time, and academic expectations really turn up in their intensity. If a student already has traits of perfectionism, studies have shown that there's an even higher likelihood that they will develop an eating disorder or disordered eating behaviors too. So, kind of all of that compounding in this age range makes it very susceptible for students to develop eating disorders. Early identification of eating disorders also leads to earlier treatment, which shortens the recovery timeline. And this supports recovery, prevents relapse, reduces long term health consequences. And kind of it's the idea that the sooner the disorder or the disordered behaviors are stopped, the less likely it is to develop into something more serious than it already is. Early intervention is really crucial. And that's why we're here. And if we're expected to intervene in early eating disorder patterns or behaviors, and the most common age of onset is among school age people, then it would make sense that school professionals have a key role to play in signaling that a student's relationship with food in their body may be unhealthy or disordered. So, school professionals and treatment providers can absolutely influence the student's trajectory in seeking treatment and recovering from an eating disorder. So, before we begin discussing how school professionals and treatment providers can support students, I think ensuring we're all on the same page with some crucial terminology related to eating disorders is really important. So, to start, I'd kind of like to get a gauge of where we're all coming from on the next slide. I'd love for you to share in the chat. Let's get this conversation started. What eating disorder specific training were you given as an educator in your teacher credentialing program or as a treatment provider in your clinical training? So think back, were you given anything specific about eating disorders in your training for whatever profession you're working in? While you share, I will say that when I was in my teaching credential program, there was not a single class that touched on eating disorders, not a single thing. There were some courses that were kind of vaguely mentioning mental health, but nothing specific to eating disorders. And I found this really harmful considering that eating disorder experiences are so vast and nuanced. It's really important not to lump eating disorders in with all mental health struggles, right? They're really their own thing. And I was disappointed to see how little I was actually taught in school. I see Amanda says, I had to learn a bit about sensory issues with food for students with IEPs, but never about the eating disorder. That's something, but again, not specifically about eating disorders. Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. If anyone else wants to share in the chat anything they learned in a program, whether they learned something or not, that'd be great, just so we can kind of hear different people's experiences. I'll also say that after the early pandemic, I did notice kind of a shift in education where the focus was a lot more on a student's social and emotional health, especially, after the isolation of COVID and having to stay home and do remote learning. The education field kind of really took a radical shift to focus on a student's social and emotional well-being as well as their academic success. And that was a hot topic in education as a whole, but still nothing really specific to eating disorders, which really shocked me. I'll give another minute or so to see if anyone else wants to share. Okay, someone's shared in the chat. I'm a recent MSW graduate and I learned about DE and IE at my field placement. DE, I'm not sure. IE, I'm guessing intuitive eating. I'm sorry. I hope you can clarify those abbreviations for me. I also researched about, disordered eating. Duh. I also researched about eating disorders in my grad program where I had an option to do so in order to get the knowledge that I sought out. Okay, so there are options there for you to learn more, which is great. I'm so glad that you learned about these things in your field placement and that, you were given the opportunity to research and learn more on your own as well. That's wonderful. Always learning those, so that's why I'm here. Great, and we're so happy to have you here. Feel free to keep putting your experiences in the chat, but just for time's sake, we're going to move on. Before we move on, I will say there are a couple more things. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Someone said so often we have to seek this knowledge out ourselves. Yeah, it's so true. Specifically about mental health and eating disorders, and in particular, we have to do the learning on our own. I mean, in my master's program, it was the same thing. It wasn't a prescribed course through the Master's of Education. It was something that I had to seek special approval for and seek special resources for and kind of like build it myself so that I could actually learn how eating disorders were impacting students. And someone else said, no specific training in master's program. My learning and education training have been pursued on my own time. Yeah, so I'm sensing a theme here. A lot of folks are really doing the learning on their own, which, I'm really grateful for, and I'm sure your students or clients are too. So let's carry on. And let's start with a really basic definition. What is an eating disorder? This might seem kind of like a simple or basic place to start, but since there's so many misconceptions about eating disorders and society typically paints a pretty skewed picture of what they are, I'd like to start with a general definition of eating disorders. So an eating disorder can generally be defined by these 4 points. It's a disturbance in eating behavior, which can mean eating too much or too little. Eating disorders can also mean a certain degree of body image distress. They're also defined by weight shifts over time. That can be weight shifts up or down, maybe both. And lastly, eating disorders are mental illnesses that cause physical and mental health impairments. I think it's really important to know that eating disorders have the second highest mortality rate of all mental illnesses, second only to the opioid epidemic. And these are serious mental illnesses, and they're also lethal. And lastly, I want to point out that eating disorders can really affect anyone, regardless of their weight, age, gender, sexual identity, socioeconomic status, race, or ethnicity. Sometimes society likes to paint a very specific picture of what an eating disorder looks like or what someone with an eating disorder looks like, but that's simply just not representative of the wide array of people who are impacted by eating disorders. And with this definition, while it's really general and kind of vague, that does leave a lot of room for interpretation for all the different ways eating disorders can prevent in people's lives. So now, to equip you with a little bit more knowledge about eating disorders, here are some eating disorders and their basic definitions. Please note that this is definitely not an exhaustive list of eating disorders, just some common ones to be aware of. And the idea here is to kind of give you an idea of the signs and symptoms or characteristics of different eating disorders for you to be aware of. And maybe these are some things that you might notice among your students or clients. So starting with anorexia nervosa, it's characterized by significant undereating and calorie restriction. There are multiple subtypes, including restrict binge and binge purge subtype, and you should also be aware of atypical anorexia. Please note that the quotation marks here on this slide, those are our addition. Atypical is kind of a misnomer, right? It's just as serious as anorexia nervosa, but because of weight stigma, it's often not taken as seriously. Atypical anorexia meets all of the diagnostic criteria for anorexia except for the weight range requirement. So moving on to bulimia nervosa, it's characterized by 3 stages. So the first is significant undereating, followed by loss of control eating, otherwise known as binging, and followed by purging. Purging can be done via vomiting, laxative use, diuretic use, or overexercise. And then the next is binge eating disorder, which is very similar to bulimia nervosa, but it does not include any compensatory behaviors after a binge. So it starts with that severe restriction, significant undereating, followed by loss of control eating or binging. But then that's kind of where the cycle stops, right? There's no compensatory behaviors or purging afterward. Next, we have OSFED or other specified feeding or eating disorder, which used to be known as EDNOS or eating disorder not otherwise specified. And this is kind of a catch-all diagnosis for different eating disorders that may not meet the diagnostic criteria for anorexia or bulimia specifically. OSFED also includes night eating syndrome, which is characterized by out of control eating after an evening meal or waking from sleep to eat overnight. Next, we have ARFID or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. This is characterized by only eating a limited number of foods due to a fear of vomiting or choking. And this is different from just being a picky eater, right? Someone with ARFID can have an aversion to certain foods due to their texture, their smell, taste, or even their color. And last but not least, we have orthorexia, which is characterized by an obsession with healthy eating. And it's not diagnosable in the DSM-5 currently, but it's serious and worthy of our attention and care. Orthorexia is really nuanced because it can present just like a desire to be healthy, But it starts to verge into disorder territory when the desire becomes obsessive and takes over other parts of a person's life. Hopefully, orthorexia will be recognized in the next edition of the DSM. So, in addition to understanding eating disorders, I think it's also important to have an understanding of some ideologies that can impact how we think about food, eating, and our bodies. First, and the most important one to be on the lookout for as educators and treatment providers, in my opinion, is fat phobia. Fat phobia is also known as weight bias and sometimes weight stigma, and it describes negative attitudes and stereotypes toward larger bodies or abnormal or irrational fear of being fat or even just being around fat people. This cultural ideology, it really like permeates and soaks into so much of what we do, how we interact, the media we consume, and how we evaluate ourselves and others. And I think this is the most important one to be aware of because we need to be critical consumers of messages and media to be sure fat phobia is not at play and that this ideology, it does harm our students, whether it's covert or overt. The next three terms are ideologies or approaches that I suggest as alternatives to fat phobia or disordered eating. So the first is body and food neutrality. The idea here is that there's no moral value attached to food or bodies of any kind. So that means removing words like good, bad, guilty, innocent, sinful, clean, all these words that have come to define different foods over time in society. It means removing these words from our vocabulary when we talk about food. Body neutrality also directly opposes fat phobia because it shows bodies as neutral. So no body type is better or worse than another. Next, intuitive eating is a compassionate self care eating framework that relies on the body's internal regulatory system about hunger and fullness. Intuitive eating is a great framework for people who have stabilized and recovered from an eating disorder to reestablish a more peaceful relationship with food. And for more information about intuitive eating, I highly recommend checking out the Balance webinar from this past July. It's all about intuitive eating, and you can find it in our YouTube channel, which we'll link at the end of this webinar. And last but not least on this slide, we have joyful movement, which is an approach to movement that emphasizes choice, pleasure, flexibility, a celebration of the movement itself, and honoring your body's intuition. Joyful movement is the opposite of what you might instinctively think of when you hear the word exercise, right? It's not an all out workout with the goal of burning calories or reaching a certain number of miles or anything like that. It's really about tuning into what feels good to you at the moment. And joyful movement also includes rest, which can be incredibly healing. So now that we have a general understanding of some important terms, we're kind of all on the same page. Let's move on and talk about some common signs and symptoms of eating disorders that you may notice among your students or clients. So this is absolutely not an exhaustive list, as eating disorders are different for everybody, and there isn't a way to tell that a person has an eating disorder just by looking at them. But that being said, there are some overt behavioral patterns to be on the lookout for among your students and clients. So the first is changes in eating patterns, which might seem like an obvious thing to be aware of, but these changes can be incredibly subtle and take place over time. These changes can include eating more or less than usual, aversions to certain foods, and avoiding eating around other people. People with eating disorders also tend to, withdraw from social situations, especially situations where food might be involved, such as eating in the cafeteria, eating during snack time at school, going to dances where dinner might be served, things like that. And this withdrawal doesn't necessarily indicate an eating disorder, but it's worth looking into as it could mean that there might be some other mental health struggles present for that person. Changes in a person's weight, both up and down, can indicate the presence of an eating disorder or disordered eating. And it's really important to remember that there's no one look to eating disorders, right? People of all sizes can suffer from disordered eating. And it's important to be mindful of that when you evaluate a person's size and whether or not they may have an eating disorder. And last, and this is somewhat aligned with social withdrawal, someone with an eating disorder may show lower engagement in things that used to bring them joy or things that you used to be really engaged in, like academics, athletics, other social activities. This could look like, suddenly scoring lower on assessments or not participating in group projects or fatiguing really easily. So those are just some overt signs of an emerging eating disorder. And on the next slide, we've got some behaviors to look for that might be a little less overt or linked to eating disorders at first glance, but These are some trends and behaviors that might seem innocent, but can also be really problematic for students or clients to participate in. The first is aligned with some of the other behaviors I already mentioned, but if a student or client of yours is avoiding the cafeteria completely or any place where there's a lot of food around, this is something to be aware of and maybe even have a conversation with them about. And later on in the webinar, I'll give some tips on how to, broach the subject of eating patterns with a student or a client. If someone is hiding food or eating in secret, this indicates that some shame or disordered eating behaviors may be involved. This could also have to do with the student's family culture around food, which is definitely worth a conversation with that student or that client. Now, the next one might be a little bit harder for you to notice or know about, and this might come through, overhearing conversations between students or clients and their friends or family members. But if they're following certain tags on social media or involved at all with these tags, including pro-Ana, which is pro-anorexia, pro-Mia, pro-bulimia, or thinspo, which is short for thinspiration, these topics and tags on social media are definitely a cause for concern as they are all disordered and really harmful, full of images and kind of a mentality that can be really problematic. And lastly, if you notice a student or a client really interested in these, what I eat in a day videos, particularly if they're comparing their own eating or exercise habits to that of an influencer, it wouldn't be a bad idea to bring this up with them. If you know a student or client who exhibits any of these behaviors and you wonder how to bring it up with them, like I said, I have some slides coming up about compassionate communication that should be a big help. So we've covered some helpful terms to get to know your understanding of eating disorders and highlighted some signs and symptoms and behaviors to be aware of. So now let's talk about how to foster trust with students or with your clients if you're a treatment provider. So again, before I dive in, let's pause for another share in the chat. I love hearing from you all. So if you could share in the chat, I'd love it if you could tell me what are some ways you can position yourself as a trusted adult for students or clients. Maybe you have some steps that you've taken that are tried and tested. I'd love it if you can share so we can all learn from each other, and I'll share out anything you put in the chat. While we wait for some shares in the chat, I'll say that my go-to tactic when I was a teacher was building relationships with students and asking them questions about their lives outside of school. So like their hobbies, their interests, sharing some of my own. That might seem really simple and maybe like not a big deal, but I noticed that the more I got to know my students as humans and didn't just see them as students who were, completing assignments in my class, the more they opened up and felt comfortable sharing really difficult things with me and allowing me to help them seek the help that they needed with their mental health. And this, foundation of trust really made it easier also for me to teach them and for them to learn from me, which was really wonderful. See, someone in the chat said, listen to students wholeheartedly and respond to them non-judgmentally when they share something with you. Yeah, I mean, listening is crucial, right? Sometimes you think, oh, yeah, of course, I listen to my students. But if you listen wholeheartedly and hear the full message that they're saying, I think of so many times that students shared things with me kind of subtly through the subtext of what they were saying. And I was able to pick up on a lot and get them connected with a school counselor or refer them somewhere else to get them more support that they may have needed or connect with their family to make sure everything was okay. I also see make yourself available to them. This is tough, but important, right? As teachers specifically, I'm speaking from the teacher perspective because that's my history. I know that it's hard to make yourself available, like, during lunch or during a break or during passing period. Those brief minutes are like your free moments to kind of reset after a class. But if you're available to students during that time, it's really important. And they do take note. And someone else said, yes, building relationships is key. I couldn't agree more. All right, so feel free to continue sharing ways that you've positioned yourself as a trusted adult for students or clients, but I'm going to keep moving through this presentation. I'll be sure to check in on the chat every so often, though. So in addition to those suggestions that we heard in the chat, there are some ways that you can be a trusted adult for your students or for your clients, particularly when it comes to their level of comfort in discussing things that could be related to eating disorders or disordered eating, or even just food, movement, and eating. The first way to do this is to actively choose to speak about food, movement, and bodies neutrally. This could be a game changer for young people because chances are they're used to people making, moralizing or appraising comments about food and bodies. And this, I want to acknowledge, could also be challenging for you because it requires you to think like a few steps ahead about how you're going to talk about food or movement or anything in the realm of disordered eating. But again, this can be a game changer because societally, we hear messages that moralize food and bodies all the time. But if you set the example and speaking neutrally about these things, it can be really impactful for your clients or for your students. Another way that you can become a trusted adult, and this is just a good practice to begin with that we've already kind of talked a little bit about, but it can be particularly helpful for people with eating disorders, is to develop an authentic relationship with your clients or with your students. And building that kind of rapport can help them see you as a person beyond your role as an educator or as a treatment provider, which can also help them feel more comfortable around you, right? Obviously you need to maintain professional boundaries, but the more you can develop a sense of trust with this person, the more likely it is that you'll be in a position to support them because they're more likely to open up to you. And lastly, this is particularly for teachers. You can actively work with students in treatment for eating disorders by providing accommodations and modifications when you can. Now, I recognize how challenging this is, especially when you have, a classroom full of students and every student has their own specific needs. It can be really challenging to provide any accommodations or modifications and flexibility for each individual. But, recovery from an eating disorder is a taxing process, and it takes a lot out of students mentally, physically, and emotionally. And the more understanding you can be with students with eating disorders, the better. So, aside from creating an emotionally safe space for students and clients with eating disorders, there are also ways you can create a physically safe space for them beyond just your interactions with them. And these are kind of like the unspoken things, right? Or physical things in your space that can make them feel safe and welcome. So first, if you're a teacher, and even if you're a treatment provider, revisit the materials in your space. If you're a teacher, I'm talking about your teaching materials, like novels, worksheets, textbooks, posters in your classroom. Is there fat phobia or diet culture present? It's still worth examining and removing from your space, even if it's pretty covert. Take a critical lens to these things and see what messages you might be sending to your students without saying anything. Next, and this is again particularly for teachers, allow your students to eat during class when they're hungry. And this can apply to treatment providers too. Allow your clients to eat during sessions if you can. And consider providing snacks. I know this is impossible for everyone in every situation. And I know it's really complicated sometimes. There are food allergies that prevent you from being able to provide snacks or allowing students to eat in a shared space. But use your discretion and give this a chance if you're able to. I think it's a game changer to kind of remove the shame and secrecy around eating, especially for students with eating disorders. And last, you can position yourself as a trusted adult in a trusted space by addressing harmful comments when they're said. So that means if you hear other students, clients, or colleagues making harmful or problematic comments about another person's weight or food choices, take that as an opportunity to compassionately call them into conversation about why their comment was inappropriate. And by doing this in the moment instead of waiting for later or, you know, avoiding it altogether, this really sets the tone that this kind of behavior is not acceptable. And it shows that to everyone present, everyone kind of looking on will see, okay, I know that I can't make those kinds of comments, or I know that that's not okay. It's really important to do that in the moment. Speaking of acceptable language, I would like to now go through some examples of language to use and language to avoid with your clients or students that may be struggling with disordered eating. So, language to use, let's start with some positive examples. So anything food or body neutral is kind of the rule of thumb here. Something like, wow, that looks like a great snack. I like those too. Or great job at the basketball game. You look like you've been practicing hard. It's okay to validate the hard work students are doing, especially in pursuing a skill. But it's generally best to steer clear of any specific targeted comments about their body. You can also, shift the topic of conversation away from harmful subjects. If you notice the topics are veering towards something diet focused or something body focused, you can gently reframe by bringing something else up. Try saying something like, why don't we talk about what we're going to do over the weekend? Or did anyone else go to the fall play? Wasn't it so fun to support our school? Bring it back to something that is neutral, that everybody can comfortably relate to. And really, the theme here is that there's so much more interesting topics to talk about than food in our bodies. And the more you can kind of practice that with your students or your clients, then the better. And the more that they'll see food and bodies as neutral along the way. So now I see some language to avoid. So these are just some examples. And all of these examples are things that I heard in my time as a teacher, things that I heard my colleagues saying with students in the room. Just to give you some context, it might seem far fetched, but these are absolutely things that adults are saying around school age people. So I've mentioned some harmful or problematic comments multiple times, just kind of vaguely. So you might be wondering what I mean. So these are some examples of what not to say around your students or clients. Firstly, anything moralizing about yourself or others. Things like, "Oh, I was so bad last night. I ate 2 servings of dessert after dinner." Or, "You're so small and perfect. I miss when I was your size." Notice that even something that seems like a positive comment or a compliment can actually have a really negative impact, because that can make someone think that they must stay exactly how they are and never change or be a certain way to be appreciated. I would also avoid potentially triggering discussions in the same space as students or clients. So if they're within earshot, keep these kinds of things to yourself. And it's safe to assume that if there are students or clients within earshot of you, at least one of them is hearing and internalizing what you're saying. So things like, "I'm doing a juice cleanse. It's the only way for me to drop the last few pounds before my 10-year reunion." Or, "Did you see how much they ate at the party last night? They totally went overboard." These comments aren't even directed at your students or clients again, but they can still shape how they view food, bodies, or eating habits just by proxy. So, after everything we've covered today so far, chances are there is a client or student that comes to mind that you think might be struggling with disordered eating. Noticing that someone you care about is struggling is so challenging and can be really overwhelming. And you might be left wondering what there is to say or where to begin. And it's really hard to have these kinds of conversations. So I try to really simplify an approach for you to bring up your concerns. And the first step is just to let your student or client know that you're concerned. I have some suggestions on the next slide, so we'll get there in a second. But even if you just say, "Hey, are you okay?" That's a great first step. And that really leaves the door open for them to share what they're comfortable sharing. Next, once you've voiced your concern with them, the next step is just to listen with compassion. You may have some guesses about what's going on or what they're feeling, but at this stage, it's most important to listen to what they have to say. Listen without judgment and really hear what they're saying. And the third thing you can do is to offer support. And I want to be clear that they may not be ready to accept help, but your offer is crucial and it can mean the world to them. You never know, they may look back and recall that you were the first or maybe even the only person to communicate concerns with them about their relationship with food or their body. And so, as I mentioned before, I have some specific examples of things you can say if you notice that someone might be struggling, and they're very straightforward. It may seem, kind of basic, but they're great open-ended statements that you can use. So you're welcome to take a picture or screenshot of this list to save for your own use. So, like I said before, just a simple, "Hey, are you okay?" You could say, "I've noticed that you haven't eaten much lately," or, "I see that your eating has been erratic." Or maybe, "I'm detecting that you've been hyper focused on calories or weight." Or even simply, "Is everything all right?" And this kind of leaves the door open for them to share what they're comfortable sharing. And especially the 3 statements in the middle kind of guide them in the direction of talking about food in their body if they feel safe to do so. And now notice that most of these are I statements. It's really important to come from a place of compassionate concern rather than blaming or accusatory statements. This again makes them feel hopefully safer and more trusting for you. Okay, so we've covered a lot so far. So I'd like to pause and see what questions you all have, or if Amanda has collected any during the first part of the webinar.
Yeah, Corey, we do have a question in here. It says, how do I help students or clients whose parents don't know they have an eating disorder?
Okay, that is a really good question, and it is a really tough spot to be in, especially if this person is underage. While I'm not a clinician, I can't give too much specific advice on this, but I would recommend connecting with family at some point, especially if they're underage, and finding ways that the student feels safe sharing this with their family if possible. And specifically, if you're a teacher, connect with your school's counselor. and see if they have any suggestions, and bring as many supports into the loop as possible to make your student feel supported. If you're working with a client, I think it really depends on kind of like the confidentiality of your relationship with that client. So I can't really speak too much on that. But at the end of the day, just make sure that even if you have to share something with the students or clients' parents, it's coming from a place of concern and care. And I think that while it might be frustrating to them if they don't want their family to know, at the end of the day, it's for the best and it's for their recovery, right?
Yeah, Corey, and just to add on to that as well, I know the best advice I received as a previous teacher was to be proactive in those conversations. So before school even started, I would spend about like a good chunk of my time, 3, 4 hours before school even started to speak with the family members. So that way, you're kind of marrying into the family before the kids walk through the door. And so establishing that relationship with parents made harder conversations throughout the year more attainable. So that's definitely a huge tip that definitely saved me with a lot of difficult conversations throughout the year, establishing that relationship with family as well.
Totally. That is imperative, right? If you can kind of position yourself as a person of the person to be trusted, not just by the student, but by the family too, then there might be more ease or openness in having these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then we did have a share in the chat as well, not necessarily a question, but I think a great topic to lean into. Um, Saying I'm a private practice, clients may come in with a different issue. However, when they talk about their interests, sports, theater, music, etc., I often find there is no time to eat between school being out at 3 and then when they may get home at 7. So just saying, hey, do you get hungry? Then they might find that they're actually skipping lunch. They don't take time for breakfast and often don't have a family meal. So many are on their own when it comes to food. And so it opens up a conversation about the importance of feeding ourselves, nourishing ourselves.
That is so crucial, and I'm so glad that you shared, because, students are busy. I think we kind of forget that, as adults, as, educators or as clinicians, we think that we're busy, go, go, go all the time, but students are taking multiple classes, they're participating in different activities outside of class. They're pretty nonstop as well. So I think, normalizing, like you said, opening up a conversation about the importance of feeding ourselves and normalizing eating throughout the day can also be a huge game changer. I noticed that, if I ate lunch with my students, they were more likely to feel comfortable eating in the kind of cafeteria setting. Or if I let them come to my classroom with a group of friends and eat there with me and my colleagues, kind of normalizing eating in a group setting or eating during the day because it's, necessary, can also help them feel more comfortable checking in with their hunger, eating, even if they're busy. Yeah, that was a really important and insightful thing to share in the chat. Thank you so much. Okay, unless there's anything else, I think we can move on. What do you think, Amanda?
Yes, I think we're ready to move on. Thank you,
Awesome.
Tori.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. So now let's talk about some prevention and different programs that are available, and specifically what barriers to prevention exist and what's been done worldwide that can kind of inspire change in your classroom or practice. So, first, in terms of barriers to prevention, and I'm talking eating disorder prevention here specifically for clients or students, there are two main things that I've noticed that can act as a barrier to prevention programs in schools and clinical settings, and these are harmful materials and harmful ideologies. So, harmful materials are any physical things that may be fat phobic or biased in nature, and this includes but is not limited to calorie counting posters, food pyramids, scales in schools, fat phobic children's books, movies. And I specifically have some of these things kind of burned into my memory, both as a student and in my work as a teacher. Specifically, I'm picturing this like food pyramid poster that not only had different examples of all the foods in the different food groups, but also their calorie amounts for each of them, which again burned into my brain as a child. And I can only imagine same thing still exists nowadays in different classrooms. I was in my health classroom, and I know that in different schools I've taught at, there are very similar posters encouraging calorie counting, encouraging dieting, which is incredibly harmful. Also, in children's books and movies, have you noticed that the villains are almost always in larger bodies? That's some not so subliminal messaging about moralizing or pathologizing body sizes. And I think that's something to be aware of and seek out more, body diversity and different representations of different people in our materials. And in terms of harmful ideologies, these are kind of the intangibles that permeate our society and make it hard to normalize preventing disrupted relationships with food. So these include fat phobic and diet centered comments from adults or peers, comments directed at students or clients, or even directed at yourself. Self deprecating comments can be incredibly harmful. And the difficulty separating social beliefs from school or your practice, and even strict uniforms and dress codes that are fat phobic in their root. So, a dress code or a uniform might not be a physical thing, but it's an idea that is restrictive for people in different sized bodies. And these are all things that can make it really difficult to set the tone for eating disorder prevention and build an anti diet accepting culture for yourself, for your students, and for your clients. So to inspire a little bit of hope after that really sad slide about the prevention being difficult in schools, here is a brief outline of 3 different eating disorder prevention programs from around the world that have been profoundly positive in their impact on students. So the first is a program called Me, You, and Us, and it's from South Korea, and it was shown to decrease negative body esteem and self-esteem 3 years after the program. So this is a school-based prevention intervention that had some serious, long-lasting positive effects on the participants' embodiment compared to a control group. Next, the healthy body image intervention in Norway showed sustained positive impacts on body image, general health, positive embodiment for the students who participated in the intervention as compared to the control group that did not participate. And lastly, the My Step program in Germany successfully reduced the likelihood of meeting the criteria for eating disorders, and it also showed a reduction of 600,000 euros in German healthcare expenses as a result. That's pretty major, and I was blown away by this one in particular because it showed the fiscal result of preventing eating disorders. It's not just physical, mental, emotional, it's also financial, right? So with these 3 programs in mind, it's hard to think of a negative outcome of, implementing a more standardized prevention or awareness program in American schools. So, while your school or practice may not have any normalized prevention programs or approaches already in place, there are some things you can do to help encourage awareness and prevention for your students or your clients. So first, and I think I already kind of touched on this, it's normalize compassionate call outs in response to body shaming or food related comments. So I mentioned earlier, calling someone out at the moment sets the tone for future interactions, but it's really important to be compassionate when you do this. That way, the person you call out will be more likely to respond positively to your feedback instead of getting defensive, right? Remember, thinking critically about diet culture and fat phobia is not commonplace for most people. And chances are someone who says a harmful comment doesn't really recognize that what they said is problematic, and compassion is really key here. You can also make it a habit to speak neutrally about bodies and food, and this includes your own body and food choices. If you're setting the tone that conversations about food and bodies will be neutral, this can have a ripple effect to your clients and students. And last, you can discuss prevention programs with your school administrators, counselors, or your supervisor in your practice if that applies to you. Note the need that you see in your work and make it known that there are students or clients that could benefit from some sort of prevention or awareness program. All right, so the last section of this webinar will point you in the direction of a few organizations that can help you take the first steps toward eating disorder prevention and awareness in your classroom or your practice. These examples may be marketed specifically toward teachers, but they're all applicable in any professional setting that will have school-age people with eating disorders present. So the first is NEDA, or National Eating Disorders Association, and they offer free tools for educators, including an educator toolkit, as well as printable resources and brochures to distribute in schools or in your provider office. And these materials are a great first step to raise awareness about eating disorders and just kind of get the conversation started. Next up, The Body Positive is an amazing nonprofit organization that makes curricula for K-8 classrooms, as well as trainings for educators to host Be Body Positive groups on campus. And their training for educators can also be applied to any professional who works with school-age people. So I'm talking treatment providers, camp counselors, and so on, anyone that's working with school-age people. And finally, Be Real USA is a body positivity inspiring organization that makes a curriculum for high school classrooms. And they also offer workshops where their curriculum developer will come to you and do a workshop for the entire staff to help change the school and workplace climates regarding body image, which is really fantastic. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to talk through some more resources.
All righty. So thank you, Korie, for that presentation on how educators and providers can help impact recovery. So I want to take a moment to share some resources that can help you all during the school year and beyond. But the first is our Balance blog. It's full of resources for anyone affected by eating disorders. The blogs are posted weekly, and they are a great resource for you or for your clients. We're actually also on Instagram. You can follow Balance, Redefine Wellness, or Mulaney Rogers Nutrition for inspiration, support, and recovery tips. Next, we also have the National Eating Disorder Association. It can be reached at this website for the resources Korie mentioned earlier. And then the Body Positivity is reachable here for their curriculum and training. Finally, Be Real USA can be found at the link on your screen. So feel free to take a screenshot of this. Really amazing resources. All right, and then another amazing balance resource we would like to share with you is our screening guide for professionals. This guide has all the tools you need to help identify disordered eating behavior in your clients or students, and the steps you can take to refer them to balance for treatment as well. So you can go ahead and scan the QR code to access the screening guide, and we will make sure to put the link in our bio for this guide shortly. All righty. So feel free to take that screenshot, scan the QR code. All right. Well, now let's take some time to answer some of your questions. And we might not have time for absolutely everyone, but we'll get to as close as we can. So, yeah, Korie, we have some additional questions inside the chat if you're ready.
I'm ready. Let's hear them.
Alrighty, so our first one says, what can I do if I have a client who is in denial of their eating disorder?
That's really tough. So first I want to send you some compassion because that can be really hard, right? If you have this working relationship with a client who you care for and you recognize these patterns as being harmful to them, but they're still in denial. Again, I'm not a clinician, so I can't offer too much specific advice on this question, but I would say, continue offering support to the extent possible and get more support in place as you see fit in terms of their family or your colleagues in your treatment practice.
Great, fabulous. And then to go off that, we have how can I support a student whose parents are dieting or don't believe in eating disorders in the first place?
Okay, that is very real. So again, I want to send compassion. As I mentioned through this webinar, thinking critically about disordered eating or diet culture or fat phobia is not really something that everyone does. And it's like a new skill. It's like flexing a new muscle, right? That doesn't normally get worked out. But I think, if you notice that one of your students is really struggling, but their parents aren't supportive, you can step into a supportive role for them by connecting them with resources that can help. And, that might look like support groups on campus or in the community, or connecting them with a school counselor or referring them to a program that might be able to assist them. And I know that there are like confidential supports available, but again, as I mentioned earlier, if your student is underage, you might be required to share some things with their families. But I think, just continue to position yourself as a person that they can trust and um, make it seem natural for them to talk about this and normalize what they're struggling with, even if their family can't yet. It might also be an opportunity for you to do some psychoeducation for the family, and provide the kinds of resources like Nita's educational brochures, for example. That can be a really good way to start. And you can also empower your client to find, or your student, I mean, to find resources that can help share this information with their family. Maybe through a balanced blog talking about a specific eating disorder that they find relatable. This can be an educational, but maybe kind of removed way for them to share information with their family if they might not be as accepting.
Amazing. Really great advice. Thank you, Korie. And then we have one more question I see here. It says, how do I start developing relationships with students and clients to build that authentic rapport and sense of trust?
That's such a good question because, as I was creating this presentation and thinking through specifically that aspect of becoming a trusted adult for a student or a client, that's a kind of a big ask, right? It's a big thing to do to, position yourself as a person that these people can trust. But I think it comes to being as authentic as possible yourself, being real. And I noticed that the more, with professional boundaries in place, of course, but the more who I was as Mrs. Bourne became aligned with who I am as Korie, at the same time, the more that Venn diagram became closer to a circle. The more students were able to see me as a human too and kind of realize, okay, she's not just my teacher. Okay, she actually has interests. Oh, I share some of those interests. Oh, okay, maybe I can talk to her about something I'm struggling with. So it was kind of like a chain reaction that started with being as authentic as possible and sharing things with them. Yeah, so I think that's also a really big ask, but use your discernment and your professional wisdom to decide what's appropriate to share. What do you think would be valuable to share in your working relationship with your students or your clients?
Alrighty, well, fabulous, amazing, amazing. Oh, I have one more. Do you have any tips or insights on how to support students who are in sports? Sometimes this can present a whole new layer of body-related issues.
Yeah, okay. That is another layer of, the students and eating disorders onion that we just peeled back. I would say it just requires another level of nuance. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that there is a balanced webinar about eating disorders and athletes. So I'd recommend looking at that in our YouTube channel. Um, if there's not, then I'm certain that there are blogs available about this topic. But I would also just say, ensuring that these athletes, these student athletes are feeding themselves, kind of like someone said earlier in the chat, normalizing feeding yourself throughout the day and talking about food throughout the day. I think that is really helpful. And I'm just seeing a message that there is a webinar about about perfectionism and performance athletes and eating disorders. So I'll link the YouTube channel in the chat in just a moment. But I think it comes to awareness, making them know that you are concerned, and normalizing eating. Those things can kind of work together to make it easier to stay healthy and positively embodied.
Great, great. Thank you, Korie. And yes, the link for that webinar is inside the chat, so everyone can, after the after this webinar, go take a look at that. So yeah, so amazing, Korie. Thank you so much. We are coming to the end of our time here. So I do want to thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you, Korie, again, Mrs. Bourne, for taking the time to discuss this important topic with us. So I just want to make sure before our 1 o'clock mark that we're able to share a few resources directly from us here at Balance. All right, so support is available for your clients or students, and many treatment options are available. So, to provide a summary of what we do here at Balance, we offer 5 tiers of programming that provide the opportunity for the most seamless road to recovery. So, our new program, the Holiday Head Start, is a 12-day intensive. It runs Monday through Saturday for 2 weeks to offer concentrated, effective treatment to really jumpstart your client or your student's recovery before the holiday season is in full swing. So this is a limited time opportunity, so we do recommend referring clients or students now. And then we also have our day program known as the PHP, or partial hospitalization program. That's our weekday, daytime or evening or IOP, intensive outpatient program. And then we have our Saturday program. And of course, we have our groups and individual services for our one on one support. And then if you're looking to collaborate with Balance or connect with us as a referring provider, you can most certainly reach out to our outreach assistant. Her name is Ekin, to work with us as well. I'll make sure to put the link in the chat for you to use to connect shortly. All right, and then yeah, whether you would like to engage in our free support groups, have a consultation call, or book an assessment, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always here to help. I'll place the links to book a call with us in the chat, or you can feel free to call us directly. Our phone number's on the screen. Feel free to take a screenshot. It's 212-645-6903. But yeah, thank you all so much for stopping by. We are so very honored that you chose to spend this time with us. Yeah, we hope you enjoyed this webinar as much as we did. For individualized conversation, reach out for a free consultation call at the link provided in the chat. And then we can answer any questions you might have about disordered eating and recovery. Oh, and also be sure to keep an eye out for our emails where we share lots of exciting announcements and free resources like webinars and free support groups. Our next free support group actually will be Saturday, October 7th at 11 a.m. Eastern with Balance's founder and CEO, Melanie Rogers. All are welcome to come. We really strongly encourage that. And thank you again, Korie. Thank you for the insightful and fantastic presentation. Your hard work doesn't go unnoticed here at Balance. So I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see you again soon.